Okay, we're getting pretty close to potentially having the 5060 Ti and 5060 launch. The rumor mill on this one's really churning. I want to talk about some of the rumored specs. I mean, they seem pretty credible based on previous 60 series cards, and not only that, the leakers have some pretty good track records. So let's talk about the specs, but more importantly, why these specs are kind of disappointing, because we're starting in our own testing to find actual real limitations on cards that are not just poor gaming experiences, but games that just won't even run. Today's video is brought to you by the new, really super cool JSUSense Melty connector shirt, paying tribute to one of the best designs that's clearly ever existed. And if you don't like the Vaporwave colors, we've got our OG gray and red colors available now. So get yours by following the link in the description below.
Nice.
Ow, I have a thigh cramp. So we've been doing a lot of backlog testing on graphics cards that we haven't even talked about or shown in charts yet. Our charts, some of the charts you're gonna see today are actually more updated than even when we did our most recent graphics card review. It's because we're trying to get as many of the cards we have to have data logged, because it's all relevant information. So first, let's talk about the rumored specs. The 5060 Ti, we'll start there. 128-bit memory bus, 16 gigabytes of GDDR7, 448 gigabit per second, gigabyte per second memory bandwidth on a 16 pin or 12 volt high powered plug. Now, there is a rumored 8 gigabyte version of that as well, and that seems credible considering the fact that the 4060 Ti had both an 8 gigabyte and a 16 gigabyte version. Let's just say there is no reason in 2025 any graphics card company should be limiting any graphics card to only 8 gigabytes, whether it's a 60 tier series or not. 8 gigabytes, 5 years ago I would have said this fine still. I won't say that today for a plethora of reasons, and some of which we'll talk about today. The 5060, which is the younger brother, obviously, 128-bit bus again, 8 gigabytes of GDDR7, the same 448 gigabyte per second bandwidth, and a 12 volt high power plug. 4060 was also 8 gigabytes of GDDR6, 4060 Ti, 8 gigabytes GDDR6, 16 gigabytes of GDDR6, depending on the SKU. Now, in terms of CUDA cores, there's no definitive number there. That's the kind of stuff that people kind of tend to rumor based on how much they percentagely will cut down dies from previous generations, but it's rumored to have 4,608 CUDA cores. I believe the CUDA cores on the 5060 were rumored to be somewhere in the high 2000s or something like that, which seems really low, but I'm not gonna even quote that number because it's really odd. It's expected to have a boost clock of 2,572 megahertz. But what makes these cards interesting is, where is NVIDIA gonna price them? Because you have huge jumps right now in tiers and prices. So AMD aside, NVIDIA currently has the 5070 at $549 MSRP. That would be the Founders Edition card only, probably most of the time. And we're talking MSRPs. I know that the real pricing isn't that, but we have to go by that right now if we're gonna compare tiers and pricing to performance models. Anyway, 5070 Ti coming in at $749.99, realistically closer to $900, which is absolutely ridiculous when you talk about the custom card variants and stuff. So you have a $200 gap between the 5070 and the 5070 Ti. The problem with that price for NVIDIA is the fact that you have the 9070 non-XT, which is sitting right, it's basically just full side mounted, if we're gonna take Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu into account here. It is fully side mounted, the 5070, right, at the same price point. Now the 9070 XT has been coming up a little short and going a little long versus the 5070 Ti, depending on the title. Again, significantly cheaper at $599 versus $749. So what that means is that card, which is already competing at the 5070 Ti level, is probably where NVIDIA really wanted to price the 5060 Ti. But you can't do that now, knowing that the card is going to be slower than the 9070 XT at the same price, and significantly slower. Not only that, the 9070 XT has 16 gigabytes of VRAM. So because you're gonna have two SKUs now, just like they did 4060, 8 gigabyte and 16 gigabyte, could you imagine if you're NVIDIA and you priced a 5060 Ti at $599 and it's an 8 gigabyte variant? Even the 16 gigabyte variant is not going to be able to have the same horsepower as a 9070 XT. We know that simply because of how it compares to a 5070 Ti. So this is why the launch looks like it's kind of been pushed. Initially, there were lots of rumors about March, because remember the previous cards came out in January and February. March seemed like a lot of sense. March came and went. GDC came and went. and no mention of the 5060 Ti, which a lot of people expected. I didn't expect it. NVIDIA doesn't really tend to launch hardware at GDC. It's more of a software type of convention, and it was all about AI for them. But moving on, now we're seeing potential rumors of a launch date of April 16th. I don't know how true that's going to be because now I'm hearing about it potentially being pushed to May. Why would they continue to push it? A couple reasons. This might be the first card they're actually going to be able to maybe head off the ROPS problem. Who knows? I feel like by the time all the missing ROPS and all the other cards, which every single SKU of the 4 that have been launched already, absolutely have examples out there of missing ROPS. This might be where the real problem was discovered and then the manufacturing process was fixed, or the fusing off of dies maybe incorrectly was causing the missing ROPS, is now showing itself in the production timeline gap between 70 and 60 series. Or that plus compounded with them going, how the hell do we now compete at the AMD price point knowing these cards are going to be slower? But now the other thing is they've kind of screwed themselves by having this major gap between the price of the 5070 and 5070 Ti. Because we already know that at $549, the 9070 XT is $50 more expensive than a 5070, but way faster. So price and value, that's a better GPU than the 5070. Even if you try and price, let's say the 5060 Ti at $499, which they might realistically try and do it, but typically they're more like around $450 to $300 or $400 price point. It is starting to become a price war for them to try and figure out what is the cheapest they can price it now, because there's actual competition at that tier, but they're not going to lose money in the process. Because the last thing NVIDIA is going to want to do is lose money. There's a reason why their color is green when it comes to that aspect. So I think NVIDIA right now is really just having to sort of try and figure out where are they really going to price these. And it's obviously compounded with the fact that you have 2 60 Ti variants, an 8 gig and a 16 gig, more than likely because they did it with the 4060 Ti, and they are, those are what the rumors are showing, plus you have the 5060 non-Ti. So 5060 non-Ti, I bet you anything's going to be right around the $279 to $299 price point. That's kind of where the 60 non-Ti's have always been. That's probably where it'll always be, right around there. Although if NVIDIA really wanted to throw a bone, make it $249. Show some gesture to the community that you actually still care about gamers, not you just stepped all over gamers to create graphics that then became used for a different thing, and now gamers are just getting 5% of your wafers, and everything else is going to data centers and AI farms and all that sort of stuff. But the 5060 Ti 8 gig shouldn't exist as far as I'm concerned, period. And the reason why I say that is as we go back and start testing these older cards, for the first time ever in our testing suite, we only have 7 actual games when we do a GPU review, like 7 actual games and 2 synthetics. For the first time ever, we have a title that in certain settings and resolution, cards that have 8 gigabytes of VRAM simply won't run properly. Minus 1 card on AMD that actually will run. That being specifically Stalker 2. Stalker 2 in 4K epic settings, hold your comments, I know what you're saying, no 60 card should ever be trying to play a title like that. The point is, every single time we've ever played, like all these other titles that have 4K maxed out settings in our benchmarks, they'll run. They'll just run like garbage, but they'll run. The problem with Stalker is because it is so VRAM dependent, the 8 gigabyte graphics cards simply do not have enough frame buffer to actually be able to load the scene properly. And instead of it telling you, sorry, you don't meet the requirements, which realistically should be the case here, it tries to run at about 0.7 frames per second. Yes, less than 1 frame per second. In fact, it's so bad, we couldn't actually truly even measure several games because the game simply wouldn't run. The game would render, it would load, you'd get 3 or 4 smooth frames per second, and then it gets to the point to where you actually cannot move or control or do anything. It literally hangs is what, the best way to describe it, it just hangs. It cannot generate the frames. Those games that like you can see on here on the chart does have like a 1 FPS, that had so much input lag because the GPU was so far behind the mouse and keyboard inputs that when Phil actually ran that benchmark track, which we do manually, there's a turn we have to take in the street, he had to pre-turn about 2 to 3 seconds ahead of when he was supposed to turn, because by the time he'd hit the key, about 3 seconds later is when it would happen on the screen. Now I was thinking that something was odd with our settings. we would go in and lower the settings, and we could potentially get it to start running at lower settings. But again, it was obvious that at 4K, not enough frame buffer, specifically 8 gigabytes. Down to 1440p, everything would return to normal. But don't forget, the difference between 1440p and 4K in terms of texture sizes is huge. And in a game like Stalker that probably isn't the most optimized, it's really not. It's just an example of a title that is very horsepower dependent. We found for the first time ever in the 13 years now I have been doing YouTube, a formula at which a graphics card fails a test. Now that tells you the way that future development is going. If you look at titles like the potential settings requirements for minimum and recommended for GTA 6, Indiana Jones, I don't think the new Assassin's Creed is terrible, but the bottom line is if you buy this card today and you're expecting to hang on to it for 5 years, you can only expect 8 gigabytes moving forward to start to see its limitations in potentially 1440p. And I say that because of the fact that the games are getting more robust. They're starting to become very demanding in the way that RT is implemented. You're starting to become very demanding in the texture resolutions, even in lower titles or lower resolutions like 1440p. There is zero reason whatsoever an 8 gigabyte card should exist being manufactured in 2025. The cost of RAM, whether it's GDDR6 or 7, maybe they don't even have 7 Plus yet. Even the 5090 is on GDDR7, not GDDR7 Plus. There's no reason for RAM to be the area that you limit the spec of your card. Just get rid of the 8 gigabyte 5060 Ti altogether if it does exist. There's no reason for it. There's also no reason whatsoever for 70 series cards to have, and by 70 series I mean 70 tier, not 70 Ti or anything, 70 tier cards, to have 12 gigabytes. AMD has been offering 16 gigabytes all the way down to their low-end models ever since RDNA has launched, essentially. There is no reason whatsoever to not have 16 gigabytes of VRAM. That is the only limiting factor between this, because if we were right now to run Stalker 2 on 4060 Ti 8 gig and then 4060 Ti 16 gig, we would see the difference that I just explained, where nothing works, the game is a 1 FPS mess, and then guess what? Oh, it can actually run, and it's not very playable, but it runs, showing you that the VRAM buffer amount is what's holding back the cards. So I have a lot of concerns about the potential high price of a 60 series, 60 Ti 8 gigabyte card and future compatibility with the way we know modern titles are going to start utilizing it. Now looking at the chart, you probably notice there's an RX 6700 XT on here. Now the reason for that is it's a 12 gigabyte card. So that extra 4 gigabytes was enough to make up the difference of being able to just load the amount of data into memory that is needed for the title to run properly is clearly somewhere between 8 and 12 gigs. It's probably realistically more like 10. And the reason why I say that is the 3080 also kind of runs like dog poop on Stalker, and it's a 10 gigabyte card. Actually, there's 10 and 12 depending on when you got the card. But again, NVIDIA seems to not be able to make up its frickin' mind on how it wants to handle memory. Maybe it just forgot how to build a card. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, that was terrible. What almost is
memory joke?
Don't worry, they'll all forget it in no time.
I wish I could forget it in no time.
Yeah, it's just, isn't it weird that here we are in 2025 and we're still having memory discussions regarding NVIDIA's cards? I don't understand why they're so fucking stingy, but they are. They're just stingy, and it's a complete, it's like, how do we make it cheaper? I don't know, let's put less RAM on there. How about you just don't split the wafers between 2 dies? That might help, because you're gonna have the same, well, unless it's another 1063 gig versus 1066 gig where they're actually not the same amount of CUDA cores and stuff, which wouldn't be surprising. That's a whole nother discussion, which it shows all the way back to 10 series. NVIDIA has sort of been, I think, probing and testing the waters to see what they can and can't get away with. And unfortunately, they've been allowed to get away with an awful lot. And so this just become the norm for them. So obviously, one of the reasons why these 60 series cards and some of these lower end AMD cards have been tested on our end prior to this launch is we have to have that data to compare it to. But it goes to show, like, horsepower is just as important as VRAM amount. And you can have all the RAM in the world, which can get a title to run, but if it doesn't have good horsepower, then obviously it's not gonna run well, which is why those cards that have enough VRAM, but they're a lower tier card, still is giving you single digits and maybe low teens in some of these titles like Cyberpunk and Stalker and Avatar when we talk about 4K. Now, yes, the reason why earlier I said hold your comments is I'm well aware nobody with a 5060 or 5060 Ti or 4060 Ti should be trying to game in 4K maximum settings. It's just not, it's not what it's designed for. It's a 1440p card at the most. Our testing philosophy around here is we test the worst possible situation, the worst possible setup to find out what your lowest amount of performance you're gonna get for that money is. That's also why we compare them between 4K, 1440p, and 1080p, even in high-end cards. Normally with high-end cards, I would just omit 1080p and say no one should be running 1080p with the high-end card. It's just the inverse of saying nobody should be running a 4K game with a low-end card. But these are scenarios people do exist in, so we have to test for what seems to be the most encompassing of a consumer and a viewer that might be falling under a certain situation. But if these rumors turn out to be true, there's no reason to be excited for it. I mean, we've already seen how the 50 series cards simply do not, they just don't carry much generational uplift over the 40 series, and that's because, like we already said, they are truly on the same process. They're on the same process as 40 series. So it's kind of like how Intel back in the day used to have the tick-tock thing. We kind of saw tick-tock on this one here where it's more of a bump speed increase, it's more of a RAM speed potential increase, and then new RT cores, new tensor cores giving us uplifts in things like ray tracing and DLSS and DLSS4 and multi-frame gen if you're excited for that. But other than that, there's really no reason to get excited for these. Unless, of course, you're running you're still running a 960, or maybe you're running like a 760 or something like that. Like, yeah, if you can get one of these cards at MSRP, absolutely do it. But you could also go buy a used 3060 Ti or a used 4060 Ti and see a massive uplift in performance, and you don't have to deal with any of the waiting in line to try and get this new crap. Anyway, obviously we're gonna test it when it comes out. GPU season is not over quite yet. We know once we get the 60 Ti's and the non-Ti cards done, we're probably done for a bit unless AMD does truly come out with like a 9060. I just hope that with how popular the 9070 XT was in terms of how well it performed, is that they just consider maybe doing a 9080 XT. Why not, AMD? Come on, man. All indicators are pointing that people are buying them, so they're also kind of getting marked up as well. All right, time to get out of here. Those are the rumors for 5060 and 5060 Ti. Like I said, I don't know what the CUDA count rumors are, but I wanted to more or less have this discussion to say, if an 8 GB and a 16 GB variant exist, spend the extra money on a 16 GB variant. It's almost like the 8 GB exists just to deter you from buying it and sort of force you into a 16 GB card. But to be honest, developers these days are also forcing you into a 16 gig card. Whether you're playing at 1440p or 4K or not, I would still get a 16 GB card. You're gonna need the frame buffer for future compatibility with titles. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Obviously, when we know more and can share more, we will. So we'll see you in the next one. Sound off down below if you're running an 8 GB card and you have run into any sort of limitation where a title just will not run properly for you because of the VRAM. Please sound off down below so we can kind of get a tally of our own of titles that might be worth adding as we sort of do this sort of testing to find out where those intersects are of, hey, if you're below this line, you're just not gonna be able to run these titles. And I need your guys' help to do that. We can't possibly test every title. So let us know where your 8 GB woes are, and I'll see what we can do to start including some of those. Anyway, we're gonna get out of here. We'll see you in the next one.